Hello, everyone. My name's Angelo. I'm the host of the Telos initiative, and I'm here with my two co-hosts.
Chris.
Matt.
And so this is our first Telos initiative group podcast. And for the topic, I thought it might be fitting to discuss language.
All right.
Okay.
Kick us off.
Let's get into it.
Cool. So, I guess first things first. Let's start with what do you think of first when language comes to mind?
Well, I think some of the first written texts are the Epic of Gilgamesh, and one of the first English language stories is the Beowulf story.
Oh, nice.
But the English language now just is imbued with so much cross-cultural knowledge and culture. Like, it all stems from Latin, Greek, and Germanic languages.
Okay. Why does Beowulf come to mind? Is that just because of the literature? When you think of language, you think of...
Yeah, you said it was like one of those psychological tests, right? I say language, what do you think of? And it just popped in there, like language, writing, and our first stories. I love stories.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Definitely. And I definitely go to the Tower of Babel. It's one of those stories that I always think of in terms of language and meaning, and that it's always attempting to conceive of something. And what we think of when you listen to somebody speak a certain language, I love thinking about this. Like, say two people are speaking French, and you don't understand French, but you understand that they're speaking French. You can track what that language might be, or you might track the characteristics of that language, but you don't understand that language. They're saying the same things, perhaps, as someone who's speaking Spanish, someone who's speaking Brazilian, someone who's speaking Japanese, but it's their way of interpreting. And now, when we think of the Tower of Babel, we think of a singular core meaning, a singular core structure that fits together, and everyone is, let's say, working cohesively on something, and they're reaching towards something, but then that language is broken apart into variations. All of a sudden, you have all these people speaking these different words, these different languages, and you don't know that they're saying the same things. And this ties into religion as well.
Right.
It's like, the Crusades going to the Arabic countries and going, like, it's pronounced God,
For sure.
right? When, in fact, you're talking about the same things, So it's about that unified meaning. I find it really fascinating that we can learn all these different languages, and it's so we can be able to connect with these different cultures, these people who speak these different languages, and they're pretty much saying much the same things.
Right. Yeah, I like that you started with the Tower of Babel. It's like a really good mythological story that maps onto a lot of different things, because ultimately it starts with this idea of unity in communication. Really, they're all trying to build a tower reaching up to God. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, they're trying to become God. And there's a fracturing to where God says, hey, you can't communicate anymore. And if you think about it, not just as spoken language, you could even map it onto different genres of language. Like maybe that story could map onto something like the arts, where at one point, all of the artistic world was reaching up, trying to go to the same unifying point, and then there was a fracturing, and now everything is in the eye of the beholder. And that's a visual language. Maybe you could think of that story in terms of just our ability to communicate with each other as a culture. It doesn't have to be just one point in history that the Tower of Babel actually happened. It could be like, hey, we use this story morally, and it maps onto something that we're going through even as a country today in the United States. We're all because we're fractured and we are talking past each other, the left versus the right, and you know, like you said, different religions and everything. That story maps onto lots of different possible scenarios. And real meaningful situations that we actually go through.
Yeah, and it has a lot to do with position as well. Like, say, when the tower breaks apart and the language breaks apart, then this group is over here in the east, this one's over in the west, this person's over here in north, south, and all that. And you're attempting to come towards the center, but you have to work your way on this journey, and you're not, and a lot of times you're not even sure that you are working towards the center, or that this side is working towards the center, but that's exactly what's going on. You know, all basically trying to reach towards the same thing, trying to reach to the same point. But you have to work through your own biases. You have to work through your own psychology and all these things. You have to go, like, this person starting from way over here, this person start from way over here. You know, hence the talking past each other, and hence the disagreement and confusion, frankly. You know,
this reminds me, or makes me think about music as a language. And I think there's a TED Talk where she speaks about music as a language, and she says this certain chord is known as the saddest chord of all.
Oh, yeah,
but it's not because the chord in and of itself is sad. The sadness already resides inside of us, and we all appeal to that same chord.
The language just gives you a focal point in which we can all agree upon. Like, that's kind of the purpose of a word, right? The word, when we all agree that this word has this meaning, we can all come together and put the thing that's inside me and the thing that's inside you together, and put it out there and express it. It's funny, earlier you kept talking about the center, and if you think about it, you're using language as a metaphor, because there isn't a physical center that we're actually trying to all come together, but we're using this geometry or this idea of a center as a metaphor to communicate, and that's something you find in language a lot of places, right? In most different forms of language, it's not quite all the way there. It's like we use a lot of shortcuts. We use a lot of this thing is a higher form of learning or higher consciousness. It's not physically higher than something else, right? It's a metaphor that we use, and it speaks to the power of language as a tool, but also that can be miscommunicated, because maybe somebody hears that word higher, they get confused and they say, "Oh, what do you mean higher? There's no higher." I don't know who would actually get confused by that. They'd have to be
you almost have to be willfully
blind.
Yeah, willfully blind. But it's like saying God, right? If you say God, and when Matt says God, and when I say God, or someone who's not of our religion says God, it can mean all kinds of different things. I remember I was at the Capitol building one day, and there was some sort of universal, like, interreligious mingling there, and I was Catholic at the time, and I asked some woman pastor there, like, "What do you think of God?" And she was like, "Oh yeah, she's great." And there's just this, like, the fundamental, nitty gritty definition of, like, oh, like, we're trying to.
It's funny, they say the word she, and it in some people you're like, I don't know, it's not really a she, is it? I don't know if I like you calling it. Or maybe someone, it resonates and they're like, "Oh yes, you're one of me. I believe it's a she as well." And it's like, what is that,
But I mean, what's really a he also, right? I mean, we have, like, the idea, the concept, right, of God the Father, and we inherit that from our religious upbringing, especially you and me, Angelo.
Yeah. Being raised Catholic, or even just traditional Christian, you would think of God as a masculine role model, and that makes sense when I think about the archetype of the father. The archetype of the father is to be the lawgiver and to be the structure in the family and to be the leader. As far as traditional roles go, the mother is the place where you come from, which is why we say something like Mother Earth. It's a container, a womb, a giver of life. But the father is like a giver of a seed. And so even at its fundamental, you could say the woman is like a big circle and the male is like a point.
Honestly, that points or puts a really interesting spin on when Catholics say Holy Mother Church.
Mm-hmm.
That speaks to Catholic theology, I think, in
it's the Theotokos, which means the God-bearer. The container for the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant. Mary must be a mother because she carried, she was the Theotokos that carried God in her womb. A father, I mean, if you think about, even in the Old Testament, God is represented as the lawgiver. That's what the Ten Commandments, and anytime something went against the rules, God was there to smite them or to punish or put right what was going on. And that's why God seems like a tyrant a lot in the Old Testament, is because that's the order and the structure comes from the masculine, and the growth and the breaking of structure is usually a feminine sort of archetype.
Mm-hmm. I have a hypothesis that's been developed over time that God appears to different groups or different people with different faces in different ways. So you have different cultures, say, to the Norse may appear as Odin or Freya, may appear to the Japanese as, Amaterasu would be one of them, the Japanese sun goddess, and to the Christians appearing as, Judeo-Christian God, right? But coming from the same place and presenting in a certain way, like, a very good friend of mine and I had this conversation recently. So she really feels a great connection to Mother Earth and Mother Nature, right? As the presiding force, the presiding all-encompassing force, right? And so I'm like, great. And so I validate that. And at the same time, in my experience, I have had experiences that have felt distinctly masculine and distinctly feminine at different points. Like a masculine voice speaking to me and a feminine voice speaking to me at different points. And I mean, I remember growing up in the church, like growing up Christian and having my falling away and becoming atheistic for a very long time, and really all along the way seeking truth, like seeking what's really the straight dope, like what's really going on, and leading to those divine experiences, leading to those experiences which I honestly can't explain with logic, and knowing that it has to be from something else. It has to be from, well, like you say, a higher power, synchronicity or whatever you want to call it, And so having that path, and then also knowing that someone else has taken a completely different path and finding their own way to this divine source or all presiding source, like whatever you want to call it, and saying like, well, you went this way and I went this way, and we both end up like, well, so all at the same time, right? So how does that all tie together, right? So there has to be something that ties it all together, where it all comes from, like, and so last thing I want to say is, so when we talk about the circle, like I think of a toroid, the shape of a toroid.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Because we think of the feminine, like I'm, long been sensitive to this, like different sides of, something that is unfolding, something that is encompassing and sort of the outreaching, the all-encompassing, like through empathy, through connection with people, through connecting the dots, things like that. And then there's the center, there's the directedness, right? There's the kind of like the concentrated heat of the sun through the magnifying glass, right? It's the focus. So you have like the unfolding, and then you have the focus, right? So those are two different functions of the one shape, right? Those are two different functions of the one singular whole. Right. And when we talk about the feminine and the masculine, it's as if we're talking about like two different energies or two different functions of one whole.
Absolutely.
Right? We have to define it as such. We have to define it as the two different sides, and people get locked into one side or the other, right? When it's like, no, guys, it's all the same thing. It's all part of the same thing.
I think if you like the idea of duality and the polarity in the universe, the feminine and the masculine is just a poetic way of talking about two different patterns. And the reason we talk about them as the feminine and the masculine is because two opposites coming together as lovers and creating something new, like life, is a very human thing. It's a way for us humans to express two different energies can come together and create something in the most beautiful way we can conceive of, which is to create life. And so thinking of you could even do it with like space and time, right? Space being a container would be the feminine side of things.
Yes.
And then time being a linear, one directional sort of arrow aiming would be the phallic masculine. If you combine the space of a circle and the directionality of time going in a direction, that's where you can get the torus. Or you could get a spiral, right? If you went in a slightly more towards the masculine end of it, you would start at the bottom, and then the feminine energy would curve it, and as it's going higher and higher and getting closer to unity, the circle would shrink, and you would get a spiral. And now we're just getting into sacred geometry.
So let's reapply the story, right? Because we were talking about the Tower of Babel. Maybe it's not that our language itself was divided, but rather our language for God became fragmented. And so...
Right.
We're trying to lead into a unity together.
Right. Our ability not just to talk in the literal sense, but our ability to even think the same and to come together the same way, because really that's what language is for. You're bringing the inside of two completely different things together. And so if you can't even agree on what a word means, how are you going to reach God?
You've really got to, So I remember when I was in a psychology, I think it was family relations course in college, our professor kept asking us, so what's the answer? How do we get out of this problem? And the only thing we could all think of as a class was communicate. We've got to communicate. What about this problem? Communication. What about this problem? Communication's the answer. And you have to do that. But not only communicate with each other, you have to communicate with yourself so that you know what you believe and what you're talking about. That's called metacognition. Cognizating.
And that gets into the idea that there is a masculine and feminine side to the self. And you want those two to be lovers, not quarrelers.
Absolutely. And God, I love that we're talking about harmony in communication as well. It's like when you know yourself, you could say that you have harmony within yourself, the harmony of knowing. When you know yourself and you know what you're speaking and you can speak it articulately, now when you speak it to people, I think it's on people to really pay attention to the reasons behind what you're saying, what it is that you're saying, not to divert the meaning behind what you're saying, assuming you're honest and assuming you are articulate and you're speaking straight, right? Because otherwise it can end up in this game of telephone where you say something to some person, then they put their own spin and then put their own spin and they interpret it to somebody else, and then the meaning gets lost over time. So you have to be able to retain that meaning, and this is a really, really good practice when you're saying, when somebody's speaking and you're maybe not sure what it is that person is saying, is this what you're saying? I feel like this is what you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
So repeat it back to them and to their satisfaction, that they can say, and this is something that's hardly ever done, but it's an excellent practice, right? So you can really confirm, okay, there's a harmony between your speech and understanding, right? So then we can come up with interpretations. Sure. Then we can hypothesize, or we can expand in different variations of thought and all that, but coming from the same, like, I keep coming back to the center and the harmony, right? Yeah.
There's unity there, right? Mm-hmm. The unity of the opposites. We can even go back to duality. Mm-hmm. But you got me thinking about the metaphor or the symbolic nature of the tongue in speech. A lot of people think of the tongue as like a sword. They use that in some of the stories that they tell, where you can defend with your words, you can fight with your words and sword fight and quarrel. Your capacity to speak really puts change into the world. It's very you could say it's a very masculine energy as far as the archetype for masculine goes.
Well, I think that's a image in the book of Revelation, right, of Christ. Mm-hmm. He has I think fiery, like a furnace mouth and a sword for a tongue.
Oh yeah, sword for a tongue. That's right.
Don't you find it fascinating that the word is in sword?
Oh man! I actually never thought about that.
Yeah,
we gotta end the podcast now. It's never gonna get any better than that.
No, come on, let's keep going. But I want to share I wouldn't even call this a thought experiment, but a model that I go to in creation, and I love sharing this. So say you have a physical object, and let me know if I've shared this with you guys before, but say we have a physical object like this, right? A defined thing of matter. You can look at it, and it's a defined thing, right?
For those of you that can't see, he's just picking up a
thing, picking up a Wi-Fi thing,
antenna,
right? The Wi-Fi antenna. Then say we have something like water or smoke that is not bound to a certain form. It can be many different forms. It's fluid, right? Mm. Then we go all the way out to something that doesn't have a defined form, or let's say doesn't even have a defined quality like electricity, right? So going even beyond that.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So
energy, you could say.
So energy. What I'm getting at is potential.
Okay.
Right? So something that can be something, but in itself is not one thing, right? So
instead of putting that up here, I would put it down here.
Okay.
The potential comes from the ground, like a bunch of seeds.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Sure. Well,
and the unity.
Well, let me finish though. So it in itself, you guys turning it down. So it in itself isn't one thing, but it can be anything, and that's the seat of potentials, the seat of imagination. It's the seat of, it's non-form. It's no thing, right? Literally, It's nothing, right? But the rub of that is to become something, it has to go through a number of articulations. So that's where we get the metaphysical. That's where we get the foundational laws. That's where we get matter. It has to pass through all these things to become a thing. And so then you have variety.
Aristotle would call that the actual, right? Potential actual,
yes.
and actual has the word act in it. It has to act in order to become
real. And so here's the rub with us. When we're in the physical and we are perceiving things in the physical, right? And that's our, like, we look around and sight is automatic, sense is automatic to us, you know? And so then we have to connect back to that place of potential, right? So that's like what we do through prayer. That's what we do, say, when we're doing magic, if you want to refer to it that way, right? So then that creates a loop, right? So you go potential to actual, back to potential.
Yeah, there's a feedback there, right?
Exactly.
And the external informs the internal, and the internal expresses towards the external.
The battery.
And yeah, it's a generator.
Yeah, jeez. You know, just thinking back to our first, like, the first thing we said, right? Like, when you think of language, what do you think of? And this is all great stuff, but it feels so, like, I think the word nothing and no thing is a good example. Like, the English language is the most advanced language on earth because of its short alphabet. We can, like, create all these really complex and complicated words from it. So it's really advanced, but it's also a double-sided sword because it's, like, it's both has huge potential and potential for being limited. And I think the word nothing and no thing is, like, a really good example of that. I'm just trying to get from, and I do understand what you're saying, but now I have to, like, reinterpret it and like state it back to you.
Yeah. Well, I think when you think about, like, the limitations of language, some of it is just in the way we use it. When you know less about your language, you're not able to use it as a tool properly. Matt, you were talking about something a little earlier. What was that thought again?
About the nothing and the
yeah, like how we're having a conversation around the center.
Yeah, like we have the central topic, but then we're weaving around it in different ways. So we're tying in language to religion, to definitions of God, metaphysics, if you want to refer to it as that. And it builds people's association with language. It builds people's understand. And really, isn't that some of what we're trying to do with language anyway, is to build comprehension, to build definitions, to build our understanding. And, you know, it's interesting, like, and this is true with programming languages as well, you know, is when you learn one language, then it makes it easier to learn another language too. So imagine not knowing any words. Imagine starting from scratch and you don't know any language at all. How hard it is then to learn a complex language. But then if you do know that complex language, and, you know, if you grow up in a country where you're like bilingual, right, where you learn, say, English and Spanish, then you know, English and Chinese or something like that, then you have that advantage as well, because then you could even say that it's twice as easy for you to learn another language in addition to that.
True. Once you've strengthened your brain to learn one language, then your brain knows how to learn. It's also kind of hard to think about what it would be like to not know a language, because I've known language as long as I can remember, and I even think in language. Like, just the way your thoughts process in your head is usually through your native language. Which is unique to humans, I guess, because how do animals think? They just must... There must be less of a... That brings me to think, does it take longer for us to process things because we have to filter it through a language process in our head? Or, you know, like, can animals really react and think of things faster? I mean, maybe we still have that old way of thinking. We just don't notice it as much because we're used to thinking about words in our heads.
Yeah. I mean, before we developed, like, Babylonic cuneiform and ancient Sumerian, we didn't have time to, like, really think about stuff. We had to spend all day, like, growing food or hunting animals or fishing. And we were starting to make representational... We had time to make representational art and, like, conduct shamanic rituals. But now, right, 21st century Homo sapiens, we have a lot of time to process language. It does take more time, but it's also a psychotechnology, right, that advances our civilization. And we're trying to make it for the better, but we're not doing a great job.
Relatively speaking, though.
I mean, we're still alive.
I mean, well, language has taken us to the greatest place that, as far as we can tell, any species... language has given us the power to connect on such a deeper level than you ever can. Yeah. As a species, language has given us the ability to save and things and memories across time. Language has given us the ability to...
That's the power of Google Translate, right? You could potentially read any literature from any country and speak to any person that you can connect to on the internet.
Well, and even just thinking about the internet and computers with digital language, the power of language gives us the ability to build processes. We can build entire worlds and realms on top of a language. Ones and zeros, well, really it depends on... The language is not just the ones and zeros, but it's there's people who came up with things like C++ and Python and Java and all these things, where each of these languages have different powers to create things on a level that one person couldn't possibly make on their own.
See, now we're tying into technology. And the way I think of technology is anything that we conceive of or use that is an extension of ourselves, of our physical selves. Like say you have an apple in a tree and you want to knock down that apple, and you pick up a stick and you knock down that apple with the stick. That stick is a piece of technology. Right?
Yeah.
In much the same way, language. Well, we have the ability of foresight, right? And so when more specifically, forward projection, right? That's something that really sets us apart as humans. When we use language, we have context. We have the ability to conceive of something. We have the ability to create something. More specifically, we have the ability to create alternative future pathways, right? So now we have the context of being able to venture into different places, create different things, have different civilizations and all these things. And so we're redefining that context at such a rapid rate, right? And we have the language to conceive of that, and we're using language to orient ourselves in those times and in those places to be able to create, to be able to connect with people, and all of that driven by our context of language and forward projection. And then we have to have the responsibility to be able to manage all that, right? Well, at the same time, all of that complexity.
I like how we were talking about two polar opposites coming together earlier, and the duality.
Okay.
And if you think about that, language is really the bridge between all of those dualities. We were talking about the polarity in yourself, how there might be like a masculine or feminine side, and how you have to communicate with yourself. There's a language there. There's a language that you have to communicate with mind and body. Hey, what's going on with my body? Hey, am I thinking right, or am I too emotional about this? You have to learn how to express yourself as an artist. Am I putting what's in my head on paper correctly? Am I saying what I actually mean? properly? Am I using this bridge as a tool properly? Do I know what words mean? No thing or nothing. Is it making sense to me, or am I just using language in the wrong way and confusing people? And then you can even think of it on a greater level of like a whole community. What are they saying all together to a whole other community? What's their message? What's the spirit and the language that these collectives use?
Yeah, that sounds like the study of like sociology.
Yeah.
Right? Looking at different groups and... Okay, so I guess maybe like the irony of what I'm about to say is that when we speak about it, we have to use a language. But we've already talked about language using words and language through our thoughts. What about and the language of music, right? Mm-hmm. How about the language of living?
Okay.
Like, I mean, and I don't just mean like physical gestures. Like I could raise my hand up and it could mean hello in one culture or society. Could mean something negative in another culture or society. But I mean, what does it mean to like have your own household and like build it up in a certain way, and does that speak to other people around the world?
Think about what is a word. Well, a word has two parts to it, right? There's the material body of the word, the scratches on paper, the sound wave in the air, or whatever it might be. It contains something. What does it contain? The spirit of the word is meaning. And that's the thing that we all are unified by. When we agree on what a word means, it's able to do its job. So a word doesn't necessarily have to be a word in a spoken language. A word can be an idea in your head. It can be a shape. It can be a symbol. It can be an action. And I like what you said about like us living. How we live can be a language. Well, perhaps you, in a poetic sense, are writing a story through your actions. What do your physical words say about you as a person? What is your story?
That reminds me of a poem from Alex Gray. And I remember like there were two lines, and it was like... Yes. He was writing about the spiritual life and how people say, "Oh, my life is a prayer," and he follows up, "Is it really? Like, are you really connected to the divine? And it's the divine living through you."
That's funny because think about sometimes when you say prayers, at least if you grew up in the Christian tradition, you might say a prayer that you know that's a certain set of words that a lot of people say, like the Our Father. And sometimes if you get caught up on doing something like a rosary or a series of prayers, it ends up becoming monotonous, and you're not even thinking about what you're saying. Your mind is elsewhere, and you're just like, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee," and you're just going and going. And your life can be like that. You can be repeating a certain action, and if you were conscious of it and you were putting it out there intentionally, it could mean something. But when you're not conscious of it and your mind is elsewhere and you're just along for the ride, living every day the same old, over and over, that's the type of prayer that you're living.
It's like it's how you say the word, like the energy behind the word.
Yes, the intention.
You could be, like, say you have two speakers and you have one on stage and they're just going through and they have a teleprompter and a script and they're just simply reading the words that are going by on the teleprompter, and then you have somebody who comes out and says it with passion, with gusto, and fuses the energy into the words. You have the felt presence, you have the felt aliveness of the words. Like you know, when people hear it and feel it, you're like, oh my God! It brings you to life. It brings it from theoretical to something that is real, like the word realize. Like it goes from just having a thought in your head to something that then becomes real to you.
Actual. Mm-hmm. Yes. Which brings me to another thought. Cuss words.
Curse
because
words.
just like you can have positive words that unify and bring people together and liven them up and embolden them and make them cry and think about their histories. You can also have words that bring people down. You can hurt people with those words, just like talking about the tongue as a sword. You can even just the... I think of it as like the impurity of language, like when you meet someone who curses a lot and they're just not careful with how they say something, and they even just use curse words to replace like instead of actually diving into the language and finding a better, more articulate word to express themselves with, they're just like effing this and effing that, and it's almost like they're pulling themselves to a lesser form of expression, but they sure are fun to say.
You know, there's a conservative Roman Catholic YouTuber in Canada named Brian Holdsworth, and he came up with a video about this topic, saying, right, our words have power, right? They have gravitas, so we could say good things, we could talk about the sacred things of life. But that doesn't mean, curse words, I would argue that curse words do have their place, their time and space.
That's an interesting thing. What is the place for curse words?
I think if your life is unjustly being threatened, you can't just defend yourself by saying, okay, move along now, please. No, you have to be radically angry and violent with your speech. It's a great way to put it.
So Jordan Peterson had a talk about curse words. He was talking about how it actually stems from a part of the brain where you're reacting to a danger. Like if you see a snake, you're like, blah! You curse. It's like it's so deep ingrained into the lizard part of your brain that it's almost like a reflex sometimes when it comes out. But that's, yeah, I guess that's
it is. It was. So I was really working on my language. I dropped the F-bomb in front of my mom fairly recently, and she politely asked me not to say that word in front of her ever again. And I did. I was really working on, not swearing and not cursing for a long time. And then at work, I hit my hand into the door so hard and unexpectedly and just let it out.
Wow.
So yeah, it is a reaction, but you have to have the...
It's crazy to think about how much cursing there is now compared to the past, and how profane language has
pop song.
Yeah, and
on the radio.
I've got
people
one
don't
more.
Even think it's.
I've got one more to add on to that, which may tie into the violent speech or defending yourself, where the bombasticism or the expression, like if you're just like, fuck me, that was tasty, or but you're not cursing it. You're like, oh my god, that would, there's an emphasis, right?
Okay.
There's an emphasis, but it's in a positive,
Well, I think
you can use it creatively.
I mean, I have a theory on that. I think people.
See, you're like.
Well, there's levity.
Does that feel like
There's levity in it, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you dive into the dirty things of life in order to, I don't know, make that's where laughter comes from a lot of the time. I mean, why are farts funny? Why is someone getting kicked in the nuts funny? Why is, think about most of our curse words either have to do with sex or something disgusting and dirty like ass or, shit or all that kind of stuff, or it's something blasphemous. Something against what's sacred. You're kind of trying to take something that's supposed to be considered holy and serious and important, and you're pulling it down.
Just to let all our listeners know, we're not blasphemers. We're not blasting any femurs here. Everybody's femurs are fine.
But I mean, there's something to the comedy side of it, right? It gives you a little bit of a, like when you say a curse word, everyone in the room is like, Oh, you said that word that you're not supposed to say.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets a reaction, and even in yourself, like, even if you're by yourself and you, fuck, you know, then you're like, oh, nice. That felt good to say. It felt dirty to say, but it was good about it.
I think...
Isn't that funny?
I think there is some psychological paper saying that if you do curse, and if something hits you and you curse, it lessens the pain that you interpret through your cognition. Like it's a mild anesthetic somehow.
Oh, maybe.
Wow.
Maybe there's a pleasure in it, so it helps with the pain. Laughter is the best medicine, right?
I think it is interesting that you mentioned that cursing, right? All of our curse words are either reaching up to heaven and bringing it down in blasphemy, or lowering into the earth and like bringing it up.
Yeah,
like something dirty or something sacred, and you have to like
it's not just in the middle.
Well,
like it's either way. It can be. It's
you're either taking a dump on something nice, or you're spreading the dump that's already there all over the sea.
We're gonna turn this into Sarah, and she's gonna be like, "You can't use any of this."
Okay, we went dark.
That's okay.
We were talking about the sacred. What happened?
The sacredness of language.
Yeah. Wow.
I think that's universal in all languages, that curse words are either taking something that's sacred to that culture and bringing it down, or it's talking about something that culture considers filthy.
Yeah.
Some curse words in different languages talk about the bottom of your feet. Which in English we're like,
well, as a
I mean,
matter
you
of
might
fact,
be able to be like, you're a foot licker, and it'd be kind of offensive, maybe.
It's just
that is actually kind of the idea behind Jesus washing the feet of his apostles. It was the dirtiest part when you're in the freaking desert and you're walking through mud and sand and dirt all day.
The lowest of the low.
Lowest thing you could do was get on your knees and wash the feet of other people.
Right. Wow.
Second to that, or maybe before that actually, was touching and healing lepers.
Wow. It's like it's cleansing the lowest part of the body. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, going back to language though, looking at it as a tool, or even we talked about it as a sword. You can think of that as a metaphor. Like you can use a sharp object, or I like the idea of a knife a little better than a sword, just because I know more positive things I can do with the knife. I'm like, well, I can at least cook and cut vegetables with a knife and prepare food for my family.
Yeah, but
Dude,
with
you don't chop veggies with swords?
If I did though,
I want to go to your house.
Dude, you would love my swords.
I knew you were a sword guy, dude.
Got lots of.
I knew you were a sword guy.
Oh, have you not seen my swords? I'll show you.
I don't think I've ever seen your swords, dude.
Oh my god. Okay, after we're done here.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, but I love. I love the allusion to like cutting with the words too, and not necessarily cutting for harm's sake, but having an edge, having a deliberateness to your words.
There you go.
Know?
Yeah.
So you're saying it's not dull. You don't just mean this or that. You're like, this is what I mean.
Right. Using the precise word is like having a sharp knife.
Mm-hmm.
You always want a sharper knife to get the job done better.
Mm-hmm.
Good insight.
I always think, just running on that metaphor, I cannot help but think about John Vervaeke speaking about what makes a good knife. And it goes back to actual and potential, because the knife is a structural, functional organization of an object that commits to the purpose of a knife.
Right. The telos.
The telos, yes.
Structural, functional organization. I like to think that's his word for soul. really what he's trying to talk about is the unifying principle.
He is talking about a non-physical object, but he's not talking about the soul. He's actually making a reference to Platonic philosophy.
Eidos.
Actually, well, I think it is the eidos. You might be right. I know it in English as the form.
And according to Thomas Aquinas, the soul is a form, which is probably where I'm getting the connection.
And with samurai, their katana was considered, like your sword is considered your soul.
Oh, wow.
They're connected in that way.
I just watched Hero, starring Jet Li.
Nice.
And the emperor, the Chinese emperor, speaks about the Chinese writing form of the word sword, because the hero, the nameless hero in the movie says, I can discern what this other person's sword play is like by watching him and meditating on his form of sword. And the emperor at the end of the movie looks at it and says, I can't tell a damn thing about his sword play from this. And then he comes to this realization that war and the sword, you can have a sword and you can use it to, kill people, and you can use it as an instrument of peace and killing and all this other stuff. And then the second form of combat after that is to sheathe your sword and to diplomat and negotiate and figure out a peace that way. And then the final and highest form of fighting is to there is no more sword. The sword is gone and you just live.
Oh.
It's just such a good movie. It is.
Yeah, I'll have to watch that, because
my gosh,
I might have seen it a long time ago, but I don't remember any of that.
It's really important. We're gonna switch gears here just for a second. I have to talk about this. It's one of my favorite movies.
Oh, please.
One of the pivotal words that the whole movie hinges on. It's probably 2 words in the Chinese dialect, but it's actually so they translated it as 2 words. And one of the assassins who tries to kill the emperor, he decides not to, because in the moment that he's about to kill the dictator emperor, he closes his eyes and realizes that the whole point of his military exhibition is to draw everyone into a single unifying spirit. And they translated it as one land. But but actually, when you translate the actual concept into English, right? We're talking about the power of language and trying to translate properly. When you translate it into English, it's actually all under heaven.
Wow.
And you need to, and that's a pivotal thing in Chinese culture today. If you grow up in China, if you were endowed with Chinese culture, that lives inside of you. All under heaven lives inside of you. And you're supposed to, draw that back to your country, like the country of China is the unifying government. That was the idea.
Nice.
That's beautiful.
Which,
wow.
Yeah, I guess one more part of the topic of language I wanted to get into is, of course, logos, which I know I like to personally talk about logos a lot. You guys have heard me talk about it.
Everyone take a shot every time he says logos.
But I figure for our listeners, let's introduce the concept if you haven't heard of it before. Logos is a Greek word, meaning it literally means word. It's also the root word for logic. But it's not just a word or just logic in and of itself. We don't really have a word that translates properly in English. Logos is something like the unifying pattern of logic. It's like a living pattern underlying everything. A pattern of meaning is really what it seems to allude to. So the Greeks had this concept that everything kind of led back to this underlying structure of meaning and purpose. And the logos of something is its deepest form or its deepest purpose in being. And so in the Bible, John 1, chapter 1, it says, "In the beginning there was the Word, And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, it's John was written in Greek, and the word for word was logos. So really what you're saying is, in the beginning there was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. They're tying this principle of God to the underlying structure of meaning and truth in that sentence. They're not just saying that God is a word. God is the thing that gives meaning to everything else.
Yes.
And when you have a dialogue, the word dialogue is dialogos. It means the logos between two people, the shared purpose. So right now we're having a shared logos in this conversation.
I love it. No, yeah, absolutely.
I always loved that concept.
I knew it was just a matter of time before you brought up the logos.
We're talking about language.
But,
it's the word for word, man.
I feel like it... I when I was growing up, right, I learned a lot of Latin. But a lot of our Western philosophy, right, hinges also on Greek as a language. Mm-hmm. Like the Greek term for happiness, eudaimonia. When you break that down, it has so many little intricate meanings.
But daimon, like a daimon is like a spirit, right? So eudaimonia is like a...
I'll have to check the spelling because that might play into it a little bit.
I think you're saying like Daemon.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that how it's spelled?
I'll have to double check.
Because that might be something there.
Yeah, it probably is.
Well, we'll have to think about it and
I know that
share it on our next episode.
It's not just like a subjective self-satisfaction. Mm-hmm. It's like there's a part of that word that means like good fortune, like literally like good luck.
Oh.
Like there's a part of fortune in it. There's moral character. You have to have moral character and be morally good to have true happiness. And then there is like a subjective pleasure to it also.
Oh.
All this other stuff.
So I love looking at different languages. They all have their quirks and different things that they do. Mm-hmm. Some languages have many, many words for some things, and some languages, they use one word to say the same thing in multiple ways. I like thinking about Spanish, and I'm sure there's other languages that do this too, but where they kind of gender everything. This brings it all the way back to our archetypes for masculine and feminine. I think that's why they attribute different genders in their language, because they're trying to hint at the different patterns in everything. There's a sort of duality to their culture, which is beautiful if you don't get caught up in the social politics of it.
Yes.
Which I can't stand neutered language. And when people take language and dumb it down just to try and play it safe, which, I mean, there is a place for that. You don't necessarily want to be provocative and offensive all the time, but I think sometimes it just takes the spirit out of some things. Like if you can't say such and such died, they passed away. Yeah. It's almost like you're taking away from the importance. You're too afraid to look at it.
Well, and this is a whole bucket of worms, this conversation, but it seems that there are two opposing sides which are doing the same thing in opposite ways, and both of them have to do with variation, conception of variation, right? So one of them, one side, I won't name which sides, I'll just say, you could probably tell which ones, just can't conceive of difference and tries to suppress difference. When sees the other, suppresses that abuse and says, like, you can't be on the same level as the rest of us, right? And then the other is an erasure of difference. Right? There is no difference, or we're not going to talk about difference. It's all blended. It's all to the. So what they're all missing is a conception that variation is one of the laws in nature. Like that's why we have so many different kinds of people. That's why You know, speaking of like animals, like we have so many different kinds of fish. Also, I mean, it's just variation is all over the place. So when we're talking about gendered language, it's like we have the, you know, like your born sex, right? Like your, you know, male or female. Then you have like your identification. Those are two. Not always the same thing, which is where it gets confusing, right? And then you have your different expression of that. You have your different expression of what comes out, and it's all these different things. But people get confused and like it has to be this or trying to pinpoint it. It's like no, it's all over the place, guys. It's just that there's some that are more common than others, right? And we have these different levels of being. We have these different levels of expression, and these different ways that all these things come out, including like in language, right? So we're talking about the, you know, masculine or feminine form of this or that word. It's like now you can just see how much it's built into the entire kind of fabric of being.
Yeah.
You know?
Which makes me think about like a garden. Mm-hmm. In a garden, there's a balance between the generative and the limiting elements of gardening. So you have the wild nature of plants, and if you just let them grow and do whatever, you're going to get a lot of weeds. You're going to get a lot of things that hurt the other plants, and it's just going to be this wild jungle. You're not going to get the optimum amount of fruit. But if you're too limiting with how you approach gardening and you're trimming everything and you're spraying too much pesticides and you're doing a lot of stuff, you're also not going to have the optimal amount of produce. You have to allow nature to do its thing a little bit, but you have to do it smart so that every plant gets what it needs. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what we need to do with language, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's it. We're going to write a book and call it The Language of Gardening, right?
The gardening of language, Chris.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Proper speech.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. Please forgive me. I'll kill myself now.
No.
Watch your language.
Well,
watch your language.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up.
All right.
Thank you guys so much. It's always a pleasure talking with both of you. I hope all of you listening enjoyed what we had to say about language, and stay tuned next time for Telos Initiative.
All right.
This has been really awesome. Thank you so much, and thank you guys. It's been a really, really fascinating, wonderful, multifaceted conversation. I really enjoyed it.